A lot of people ask us if mods are legal or not, and it certainly depends on where you live. But in this video, we're going to look at 10 common mods that are illegal pretty much everywhere you go. So whether a mod is legal or not depends very much on where you live, because every country seems to have a completely separate list of laws. But there are some principles that apply to most areas and most regions, and just by following those sets of principles you can avoid a lot of the problems with legalities. So one of the frustrating things is there's a wide area of interpretation with regards to the law. And here in the UK, like most areas, we have an annual roadworthiness test, so we call it the MOT test. And the guidelines that are given to MOT testers vary from those that are given to the police when they come to stop and check a vehicle. So it may be a case that your vehicle passes an MOT but would fail on a police spot check. So we need to just flag up some of these areas and just make sure that we stay on the right side of keeping our car legal. So one example of that is having a sun visor at the top of the screen. So the MOT tester will, generally speaking, just check that it doesn't obscure the driver's view of the road ahead, and if it doesn't, he will give the car a pass. But if a policeman were to examine the same car, he would be working to a rule that states that the visor at the top of the screen must not extend into the sweep of the wiper blades by more than 1 centimetre. So an obvious shortcut to that is to shorten your wiper blades. But that just flags up the minefield that we're opening up here of mods that are technically legal depending on whether you're talking to an MOT tester or to the police that are involved. And sometimes people have been stopped by the police and they've even taken the offence to court and had a judgment passed that went down in their favour, and the application of the law at the discretion of the particular policeman was considered too extreme for the circumstances. So the first obvious mod that we would certainly want to flag up is the use of lights on the vehicle. So in most countries you need to have only red lights to the rear of the vehicle other than the reversing lights, and no blue lights or flashing lights or otherwise distracting lights anywhere else on the vehicle. So that would rule out brightly coloured undercar neons in most regions and areas. So it's fine to fit these things for show use, but if you're driving on the road you will get pulled over and stopped and some sort of ticket or citation in most areas that you go. So be careful on your choice of lights. You certainly don't want to have any different coloured bulbs in the front of your car. I think we've all at some point maybe put a blue bulb in there or a different coloured bulb just to be different. I've certainly had them pulled out at the MOT and replaced with standard bulbs, which was frustrating because it cost me a bit of money, but there you go. That's life. It kept the car legal, and if someone had told me in advance that I couldn't really do that, then it would have saved me wasting that money. So there you go, here's the advice for free. Another common area that people often fall down in is window tints. So applying a tint to your car windows can actually cause a lot of problems if you've not followed the regulations. So check what the regulations are. The cars look quite cool when they've got blacked out windows. There's practicalities as well, especially in the summer. The temperature inside the car can get quite hot, so if you've got a fairly heavy tint, it can reduce that thermal transfer to the inside of the car and help keep things cool. But in most areas, and certainly in the UK, there are very strict limits on the amount of light that must be transmitted through the glass. And it is around about 75% of light transmission is required at the front of the car. You can usually go with a slightly darker tint to the rear of the car and on the back windows. But in most regions, most states and most countries, you've got to be very careful with how far you go with your window tinting. And a lot of these DIY kits don't actually stipulate the amount of light transfer. So you'll get stopped at the roadside. They will measure the amount of light that comes in, and if you fail you can find yourself with fines, get your car impounded, and have all sorts of legal problems and issues. So it is best avoided. Check before you do a mod in your area just to make sure it's legal, and you'll avoid a lot of these pitfalls and problems. So another fairly common mod is the exhaust. People put higher flowing sports exhaust on, and that normally comes with an increase in noise. Now in most areas, if you've adjusted the output of noise of the vehicle vehicle from what was originally approved on that car, you can fall foul of the law. Here in the UK, there are fairly strict decibel limits that vehicles can emit. It depends on the age of the vehicle, but if your sports exhaust is making too much noise or can be considered a nuisance to others in the neighbourhood and on the roads, then you can find yourself on the wrong end of the law. So be careful when it comes to modifying your exhaust. And while we're talking about exhausts, we should also talk about removal of catalysts. So the catalyst does a lot of work in cleaning up the emissions of the car and keeping you on the right side of those emissions regulations that have been stipulated for your country. So whether that's measured in CO2, particles or some other gas emission, whatever it is in your area, you need to make sure that your vehicle still meets those emissions. So you might even get away in some cars of removing the catalyst or the DPF and still meet those emissions requirements. But if that's the case, there may well still be a law that states you cannot remove these pollution control systems from your car. So if you've taken off something that was originally designed to be on the car to reduce the emissions, you can certainly find yourselves on the wrong end of the law. So be careful with that one. There's so many exceptions and there's so many fine details out there. It's very easy to find yourself on the wrong side of the law. So do check. Things do change as well. I know in the UK you used to get away with DPF removals, but that's certainly not the case now. It's been tightened up, and I think what was more of a general regulation or guideline has actually been solidified and it's now in black and white. So removal of DPFs from your car is a strict no-no. But in most areas you can actually replace those DPFs with higher flowing sports alternatives, which give exactly the same power gains as you would otherwise get with removing it completely. So there are other options, but that's not available in some countries. I know that in some states and some countries you can't even replace catalysts or DPFs on a vehicle if they're in working order. You're only allowed to do it once they've failed and with approved aftermarket parts. So nitrous oxide, it's an additional fuel that's pumped into the engine and it substantially adds power. You get a short burst of an extra 25 to 60 horsepower just at the flick of a switch. So you can see the appeal as to why people would do this mod. But in most areas it's illegal to use nitrous oxide on the roads. Some countries stipulate that there is only one fuel type allowed to be used in a vehicle at any given time. If you were doing drag races and you're doing off the road use of your car, then it's certainly a good idea to get nitrous and just max your power out and take your car to that absolute limit. But on everyday roads, in most areas, you won't get away with even having it in the car. Although some countries you can carry nitrous bottles and nitrous kits, and in others you need to display warnings on the car. And in some regions you cannot carry these explosive gases in your vehicle at all. So again, check your local guidelines and your local regulations because it does vary. When a car's sold, it's tested for safety, and often removal of those safety devices would make the car illegal. So replacing the steering wheel seems like a good idea. There's so many sporty steering wheels, and back in the 80s that's what everyone used to do to their car. They'd fit the rally steering wheels with the nice grips and just go for the styling benefits. But that nowadays would usually necessitate removal of the airbag. So if your car came with an airbag, to keep that car legal on the road in most areas you need to have an airbag that's fitted. And the same applies to race harnesses and seat belts and other internal safety devices. You need to keep the car as it was originally approved in most areas. If you're in an area that's a bit more flexible, then that's good. And the same is true to other mods, including just general tuning. If it affects the emissions of your vehicle and takes it outside of what the car was approved, you can run foul of the law. So be very careful when it comes to tuning. And generally as a tuner, you want to make the car as efficient as possible. You want to use the fuel as effectively as possible. And usually if it's not burning correctly or it's running too rich, you're not getting the maximum amount of power from your fuel. It obviously depends a lot on the engine and the setup, but just keeping the car running as efficiently and cleanly as possible, it makes a lot of sense as a driver and for performance benefits. Another area to be very careful about is tyres. So there's a perception that all you need to do is make sure that the top part of the tread is inside the frame of the car. Now, if you've got bits of the wheel lower down that's sticking out, or you've fitted stretch tyres where only the tread is in, but you've still got the bulk of the alloy wheel outside the bodywork of the car, that's going to draw a lot of attention to your car, and you're probably going to hit legal problems problems in most areas. So generally, looking at a car, if it's got things sticking out that could injure a pedestrian if there was a crash or an impact, then you won't get away with it. Most law enforcement officials will pull you over and give you some kind of citation or warning because of that, because it's a potentially dangerous defect on the car. It also applies to sticking wings and spoilers on the car. If they could cause injury to other people, there's a big argument that they are illegal and you need to get them addressed. So think very carefully about the car and its structure, and make sure there's no bits of the wheels sticking out further than the body of the car. So fitting non-approved parts to your car is another issue, and a lot of parts are sold for off-road use only. You see that on the boxes, so you think you're buying something that's set up for the competition, but actually in most cases they just haven't bothered getting it tested for road use. So it may be using defective materials, it may not be made to high safety standards. Metal parts may crack and fail when put under the stresses of everyday use. So in most countries you can only fit parts to your car if they have been approved and safety tested. It makes sense. You don't want to be putting dangerous parts on your car, and don't ever make the mistake that just because a part is labelled for competition or motorsport use that it's going to offer some benefits, because often it's just a manufacturer cutting corners. They've not bothered to get it properly checked and type approved. So don't fall foul of the law just because you've cheaped out and bought dubious parts from a dubious parts supplier and then fitted them to your car. They don't generally care what they're selling you. I know in some areas the regulation is catching up with a lot of people selling dangerous parts or modifications that would make the car illegal. So I expect to see more of that, and it's going to get harder and harder to modify cars in most areas. But that's a bit of a shame really, because a lot of the real car enthusiasts are making the car better and improving on what the original manufacturer had designed and set the car up for. So you're making the car safer and more enjoyable to drive. So the final thing that we need to flag up is to notify your insurers. So when you fill in your insurance form, certainly in the UK and in most areas, it asks you if your car is modified. Now it frustrates me that when you fill in a claim form, it doesn't just say is your car modified, it'll often say is your car modified, specially adapted, had non-standard parts fitted, or been specially tuned or modified in any way, shape or form. So they're asking a much more specific question when you put your claim form in. So if you answer yes at that point, they're going to throw the claim out. The insurance companies do not like paying out money. They will use any excuse they can to get out of dealing with a claim and making a payment, and that can actually leave you without insurance. It can leave you liable to prosecution for driving without insurance, and if you've had an accident and done damage to other cars or other people, you can be held personally liable for the costs incurred as a result of your accident because you've not got the benefit of the insurance. So be very careful. It doesn't actually make sense to modify your car and not tell your insurers. So if you go to a specialist car insurer, you'll generally find preferable rates. So the way insurance works is they look at the amount of claims that people submit, and they try and predict how much likelihood there is of each person making a claim, and they divide the cost up of these claims plus a bit of profit and their costs and everything among all of the policyholders. So each person is bearing a proportion of the risk for themselves and for others. So if you're a particularly careless driver, the careful drivers are paying for you. So in order to make it fair, the insurers are drilling down and looking at very, very specific details in each person. So you're much more likely to be paying a premium that is proportional to the risk that you're actually presenting. So going to a specialist insurer, you'll actually find that a lot of those are filled with owners that are very careful with their cars. They've modified their cars, they've adapted them, they've spent time and money on the cars, and the last thing they're going to do is drive recklessly or have an accident. So they will often offer better premiums. So it's always worth asking the question, if you're planning to modify your car, go to your existing insurer and just ask them, will it affect your premium? Chances are it probably will, because you've not gone to them in the first place. So a lot of companies are quite flexible with the common mods that people do, but some of the higher powered increases that you get through other mods may require special considerations. But always go to a specialist modified car insurer and get a quote from them for the parts, and you'll know that your car is properly properly covered. If you have an accident, you will get the money back to replace the performance parts you fitted, not just standard ones. And you certainly won't find yourself in that situation where your insurance is invalid and you're stuck dealing with a claim yourself and facing prosecution for driving a car without insurance on the roads. Keep it safe, stay legal, stay tuned. If you haven't done so already, please subscribe and hit that like button because it really helps us to get out there. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.